the ICH. We're going to be talking about the ICH renovation, the GCP renovation, but we're going to focus on this document E8. So where we're up to in this renovation project, and it's been going on for several years now, the ICH is basically consulting on revision of guideline E8, which is general considerations for clinical research, and also guideline E6, which is ICH GCP. So we do now have the final version of ICH E8. So it's E8 revision 1. So it is final. And that's what I'm going to take you through, is just what's in there and some of the key things that we need to think about in terms of implementing that guideline, because it is something now that the regulators are going to start looking for in inspections. And also I had a mock audit with a client recently, and it was something that was picked up in that mock audit as well, mock inspection, was the fact that we didn't have any record of how we were implementing E8. So that's kind of why I've included it, because it is where the rubber's beginning to hit the road and we do need to start implementing it now. E6, so ICH GCP is also being revised. We've got the draft principles of that document, but that's as far as we've got at the moment. I think the new version of at least part of it, they said would come out probably next year, possibly the year after, but we don't have a final version of that yet. So we won't talk about that one, we'll just talk about E8. There is obviously loads more information on the ICH website. And all I can do this afternoon is just give you a very brief overview of some of the key changes and the implications for running clinical trials. The other thing, just to remind you of when we're talking about ICH documents, is that they do only apply to medicinal products. They don't apply to any other kind of research. So they don't apply for medical devices or for any other interventions. They are specifically focused on medicinal products, and they have made that very clear in public meetings. So just to make you aware of that. Obviously, there is overlap in the principles between the different types of research, but ICH specifically only applies to medicinal products. Okay, so there are 7 chapters in E8. So there's the objectives, there's the general principles, and then there are 2 kind of new buzz phrases that have come in with this document. So there is quality by design, which is what chapter 3 is about. So designing quality into clinical trials, so QBD, or quality by design. And then there's also the critical to quality factors, or CTQ factors, that are in, you can see it's in chapter 7 there, but it really runs through the whole document, that it talks about critical to quality factors all the way through. So chapter 3 is about the quality by design bit, and then that feeds into the drug development planning, and then the design elements and data sources for clinical studies, and then the conduct, safety monitoring and reporting. And then that chapter 7 is about considerations in identifying critical to quality factors. There is also an annex that looks at the different types of clinical study, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when we look at the drug development planning bit. Because that's where that kind of fits in. Okay, so the principles, they can be kind of summarized in these 3 issues. So there is participant protection, which has always been at the forefront of GCP. It's always been our primary consideration. And then there's the scientific integrity of the research that we're doing. And then there is also a principle of having patient input into drug development. And this is where things are beginning to change quite significantly. We've been talking about patient centricity and participant engagement and all of that kind of stuff for quite a long time. But this is making it a requirement to have patients' input into drug development, and into the design of our clinical trials, and into even the design of the drug development part. So it is really important, and that's one of the reasons that I've invited Shelley along today, is because this is something that we really need to get better at, and the regulators are going to start looking for this. And the other thing to say is that, and whether it'll come through in the final version or not, I don't know, But the MHRA in the UK, in their initial consultation on new legislation for the UK for clinical trials, there is a proposal to make this a legal requirement for clinical research in the UK. So that, again, is, the MHRA are taking this very seriously. So if you are based in the UK, that's something to kind of bear in mind, but it's going to be relevant everywhere. Okay, so the quality by design bit. So this is really chapter 3. It's making the point that quality should be the primary consideration, which sounds kind of obvious, and you would hope that's what we're all working to, but it's really setting this out. And some of the things that it highlights are thinking about our objectives, making sure that they are clear and scientific, thinking about the participants that we're including in our trial, and that they're going to be appropriate in terms of the condition, the treatment, but also the target market as well. Minimizing bias and control of confounding. So thinking about how you minimize bias and how you account for or mitigate for confounding factors. And then the endpoints need to be clearly defined. They need to be clinically meaningful. So that's where we need to get input from physicians. And also they need to be relevant to patients. And again, this is where the idea of involving patients in our trial design comes from. And it is really important, because I think historically, both the pharmaceutical industry and also the healthcare professions have taken quite a patriarchal approach, if you like, to us thinking we know what patients want and we know what's best for patients, and we don't always get that right. So for example, we might think that control of pain in a condition might be the most important thing for a patient. But when you ask the patient, that might not be the most important thing for them. It might be mobility and being able to move and get around and do things. That might be more important to them than control of pain. So it really is important to get patients' input and to find out what patients are looking for from treatment, but also how to design a clinical trial to make it easier for patients to participate in. And then it also talks about risk proportionate approaches. So the whole area of risk assessment and risk-based quality management, that's not going anywhere. That's still going to be at the focus of everything that we're doing. And that kind of feeds in as well to the whole thing about critical to quality factors. So the definition there of a critical to quality factor is an attribute of a study whose integrity is fundamental to the protection of study participants, the reliability and interpretation of the study results, and the decisions made based on the study results. So it really is about what are the most important things to get right in order for us to meet the objectives of this study and make sure that our patients are being protected. So what they're saying that organisations need to implement in terms of identifying critical to quality factors. So these are the things that the regulators are going to be looking for when we say we're implementing ICH E8. Open dialogue, so a culture of open dialogue, focusing on essential activities. And there really is quite a push from regulators to simplify protocols and to really think about endpoints and really think about the amount of information that we're collecting in a clinical trial. Engaging stakeholders, and that means both internally within the sponsor organisation, but also physicians and patients externally as well. Reviewing critical to quality factors, so actually building that into our clinical trial design process and our clinical trial management process. So identifying the critical to quality factors for this particular clinical trial. And then also thinking about feasibility in operational practice and how the critical to quality factors can be made feasible as part of our design. There is then a list in chapter 7 of 18 considerations for critical to quality factors, which for obvious reasons I'm not going to go through now because it would take far too long. So they kind of had it as an annex to begin with, and they had a long list of things that might be critical to quality factors, but they've kind of taken a different approach with this final version and taken out that annex and puts it in as a chapter around more about how to identify them rather than saying these are the things that might be. So they're really putting the onus more on the sponsor. Okay, so that's the critical to quality factors. Then drug development planning. The areas that they want us to focus on in terms of drug development planning are the quality of the IMP, so the GMP requirements and making sure that it's appropriate and that it's the product that will go onto the market as well. There's a bit in there about non-clinical studies and making sure that you've done sufficient non-clinical studies to feed into the clinical studies. And then with clinical studies, they've outlined these 4 phases. So, you know, we're used to hearing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and they're not using those numbers. They're using more descriptions. So this is how they describe them. So there's human pharmacology, which is the first in human. So that's kind of phase 1, but it could be healthy volunteers or it could be patients. There's then exploratory, which would be the equivalent of sort of phase 2. So once we've done the kind of almost like the pilot human pharmacology ones, we then start to look at, does it actually work? You know, maybe confirming the dosage that we're wanting to use. And then the phase 3 type trials, they're calling confirmatory. So those are the kind of pivotal phase 3 trials, which will give you statistical significance and allow you to apply for marketing authorization. And then there's post-approval, which might be interventional or non-interventional. They also talk about some of the more novel or innovative or complicated, if you want to think of it that way, of trial design. So looking at adaptive trials, platform trials, and master protocol trials, and how they might combine the different stages in an adaptive protocol or a master protocol, for example. FDA, yeah.
Can I just ask a quick question about that? Because doesn't that go against the earlier part where they said to keep protocols simple?
Yeah.
Because this is making protocols incredibly complicated.
Yeah. And I think, you know, from what I've heard, investigational sites hate these because they never know where they're up to and which bit of the protocol they're in, and there's so many protocol amendments because of the adaptations. I think it's really difficult. So yeah, I think it's a bit of, I guess they're trying to make both ends meet. They're trying to encourage us to simplify, but they also want to acknowledge that things have changed and certain types of research, they want to do things differently and not have the traditional phase 1, 2, 3, 4.
I mean, I'm seeing protocols with, you know, effectively phase 1 to 3 all bundled up into one protocol with, you know, multiple options at multiple stages. And one is a complete nightmare to write the protocol. And 2, you know, I'm almost bailing on writing the reports up now because they're just going to be a complete nightmare because you've got so many patients doing different things.
Yeah, and also I think it must be a nightmare for the statisticians as well to work out how to analyze the data when it gets to the other end. So yeah, no, I take your point, and obviously it is kind of, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. It's a bit of a kind of a paradox, really. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't got an answer for you.
That's all right. I didn't think you would have, but it's just, it seems like, you know, more people seem to be going down this adaptive master protocol platform route than the let's keep it really simple route.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Thank you.
We may find in a few years' time that they backtrack on it and start to ban master protocols or something, but yeah, we'll see. Yeah. And the other thing is obviously we'll talk about it again under sources of data, but the whole area of real world evidence and trying to incorporate that into clinical trials is a bit of a nightmare as well, I think. So yeah, it is getting more complicated by default in some ways. Yeah. Okay. So it then talks about the design elements and data sources. So it talks about those different trial designs that we've looked at. And then it looks at the design elements that we need to think about when we're writing clinical trials. So study population, inclusion, exclusion criteria, treatment description, including things like dosage regimen and precautions and all of that sort of thing, and dose escalation if you've got an adaptive trial or a pharmacokinetic trial. Choice of control group. Again, that's quite a tricky area, because particularly for some of the advanced therapies, it's very difficult to actually have a control group, and therefore that's where real world evidence sometimes comes in terms of using historical data as a control rather than an actual control group of patients. So but it's about choosing the right control group and justifying the choice of control group. Response variables, obviously looking at efficacy and safety, and again trying to minimize those rather than just keep adding more and more endpoints. It's important to identify what the objective of the trial actually is, and therefore what endpoints we need, therefore what response variables we need to be measuring. Methods to reduce bias, and also obviously confounding. So randomization, blinding, and also stratification if that's appropriate, if there's a potential confounding factor. But again, that can be quite difficult, particularly in some of the more advanced therapy products. So again, it's about justifying your choice and the decisions that you're making. Statistical analysis, it's important to have that set up front so that we have clarity on how we're going to analyze the data. And again, I would imagine, I'm not a statistician by any stretch of the imagination, but I would imagine that for the more complex trial designs, that statistical part gets very difficult. And also any interim analyses would need to be scheduled up front as well, and things like independent data monitoring boards and how they're going to work and that kind of thing. And then study data, looking at the sources of data and data integrity. So that's thinking about things like electronic case report forms, lab results, electronic patient reported outcomes and how they fit in, and the data integrity issues that there can be with those. And also, if you're using, as I said, real world evidence or real world data, how do you monitor the integrity of that as well? So just thinking about all of those different aspects of where the data are coming from, and how reliable it is, and how confident we can be on data integrity. So that's a very quick summary of the kinds of things that we need to think about. So it really is about the quality by design piece, about involvement of patients and participants. It's about critical to quality factors and making sure that we are seen to be identifying and managing those. And that's where your risk assessment really needs to start then, is from those critical to quality factors. They need to be the ones that you incorporate in your risk assessment approach as well.